Excelsior, true believers! You are about to embark upon a journey, a trip to the 70s and 80s when mighty Marvel Comics ruled over all. The Defenders, Doctor Strange, the Champions, Deathlock, the Submariner, the Incredible Hulk, Killraven, the Son of Satan, the Macabre Man-Thing, and all your other Bronze Age favorites every week appearing on Defenders Dialogue. Now here are your guides, Christopher Golden and Brian Keene.
Excelsior, true believers, and welcome back once again to Defenders Dialogue. I am Brian Keene, flying solo this week. If you follow Christopher Golden or myself on social media, then you know that we are in the process of editing an anthology called The Drive-In Multiplex, which is a tribute anthology to Joe R. Lansdale's classic seminal novel, The Drive-In. Chris is busy with that this week, so this is I guess you could call it a filler episode, but it's not, because it ties into what we've been talking about. And this is not the first time we've done something like this. If you go back to episode 44, which ran in October of 2018, Chris and I again faced the dreaded deadline doom, and Marvel Comics legend Scott Edelman was kind enough to step in for us, and he presented a fascinating, long-lost interview with Steve Gerber himself. Steve talking to Scott about his time on the Defenders, Man-Thing, Omega, and a bunch of other Marvel comics. What we're going to do today is something a little similar. We're going to hear from Steve Gerber himself. This time, instead of an audio recording, which is what Scott used, I am going to be reading excerpts from a book called Steve Gerber Conversations, which is edited by Jason Sachs, Eric Huffman, and Dominic Grace. It's published by University Press of Mississippi. It came out last year during the pandemic, or at least that's when I got it. And I got to tell you, folks, if you are a Gerber fan, or if you are a fan of Bronze Age Marvel, or the things Gerber did later, like Destroyer Duck and Thundar the Barbarian, Phantom Zone, all the way up to Hard Time, his last book there at DC before he unfortunately passed away. This book is excellent. I can't recommend it enough. So anyway, since we are in the midst of covering Gerber's run on the Man-Thing, I thought it would be interesting to actually take a look at what Gerber himself thought of that run and thought of those stories. And to do that, we're going to, as I said, we're going to go to Steve Gerber Conversations. This is an interview with Gerber conducted by Mark Lehrer over the holidays in 1976 and 1977. It originally appeared in the Pittsburgh Fan Forum, issue numbers 30, 31, and 33. Now, as I said, I'm not going to, read the thing in its entirety. I just want to read some excerpts to you here. They're talking in the interview about the limitations of the form of comics and Gerber's attempts at writing serious drama and satire. And he talks about the Man-Thing series in particular. And let me read you a clip of that. He says, "My own feelings about the Man-Thing was that I was embarrassed by a lot of the letters. I was glad on one level that I was touching these people this way, but it seemed so much like television soap opera and stuff that was only innovative because the rest of the comic books were 20 years behind the times. I felt silly taking credit for it. Some of those stories I'm embarrassed by." He talks about Bus of Fools and A Question of Survival, which Chris and I have covered already. I think that's Fear issue number 18. He says, "I look at a story like that now, and I'm really tempted to laugh nervously at it. It was a very primitive attempt at the very thing I loathe most of the disaster movies for. All the stereotyped characters, it was like dumping Sergeant Fury's brigade in the swamp and letting them focus on their racial and ethnic differences for 17 pages, stagger out with the girl and the child and the cliche ending. I dislike that story intensely. The Edmund story, The Kid's Night Out, which appears in Giant Size Man Thing number 4, which Chris and I just covered on last week's episode, is not quite as much of an embarrassment, but it wasn't terribly successful either, because in the end, mostly because of deadline pressures, I found myself resorting to that silly scene in the gym with the girl hanging from the rings and Man-Thing walking in as a ghost in the machine, battering everybody to death. It got silly after an attempt to really build up something. I do like some of the dialogue in that story. I do like portions of the text pages we did in that story, but overall, I was not pleased with it. It didn't work for me. Now, I find that curious, listeners. Chris and I talked at length last week about the impact that Giant Size Man Thing issue number 4 had on me. And I had a chance to share that with Steve Gerber. If you go back to early episodes when we started covering Gerber's run on the Defenders, I talked about how while I never got to meet him in person, I did get to correspond. We exchanged some letters, and I sent him a copy of my first novel, and, he was very gracious, very nice guy. But in one of those letters, I told him, if not for Giant Size Man Thing issue number 4, I wouldn't be doing this. That was key. That was one of the major things that put me on this path. He only commented, hey, that's nice to hear. I'm paraphrasing, but, never a hint that he felt this way about that particular issue. So I found that interesting. He goes on, when asked to talk about his inclination for writing extreme tragedy or extreme humor, he says, I find humorous tragedy a very appealing combination. The Four Feathers of Death story from Howard the Duck issue number 3, and the Decay Meets the Mad Viking story from Man-Thing issue 16, which again, Chris and I have already covered. These stories represent to me something that hasn't been done in comics since the era of EC, where you have the most horrible things happening in the silliest possible way. The Viking character had a specific intent, parodying all those macho stereotypes we've got in the comics. I wanted to create this aura of tragedy and decadence and glitter and silliness and present this real tragedy in what I think was a very humorous way. There was blood spilled, there was death all around, but to me, that was a very funny story. The interviewer says very few people found it funny, and Gerber says, I know, that disturbs me. The reason they didn't find it funny, I think, is that they are conditioned not to look for humor in a story like that. Man-Thing is a serious comic, ergo, everything must be serious. The Duck is a funny comic, therefore it's okay to laugh at that. The serious aspect of the turnip story and the kung fu story of the Duck, again, he's talking about plot lines from Howard the Duck, which we will get to eventually, also disturbs some people because they weren't expecting it. I find that most people liked and were able to accept these stories more than they were able to accept funny Man-Thing stories. Now, I find that interesting. If you go back and listen to the episode when Chris and I cover Decay Meets the Mad Viking, that's pretty much our reactions. Chris in particular found it, pretty silly. The David Bowie / Alice Cooper character particularly, so it kind of fits in with what Gerber's saying here about the audience reaction. He goes on to talk about how it's okay and accepted and standard for superheroes to argue. It's okay for them to display human emotion and not have all the answers at their fingertips. Those things are now part of, dare we say it, the comic book cliche. After 15 years, you expect that. The problem now is going beyond that, breaking out of the cliche and going on to establish a new cliche to be shattered again. One of the things that upset me when I went over to National, what he's talking about when he says National, he's talking about DC Comics. During the 2 weeks I wasn't working for Marvel, was that I spoke to Jeanette Kahn about what sort of things she might be interested in my doing over there. She wanted another book like Howard the Duck. When I told her I didn't think the answer was another funny animal, she looked a little bit disappointed. So you can see here that this is 76, 77. So this is shortly after the end of the Man-Things run. And, it's all leading up to Gerber's frustrations with the industry, which we've covered at length when we talked about his Defenders run. The interview goes on, and like I said, I encourage you to reach out this book because they touch on so many subjects just in this interview alone. But he goes on talking about the success and failure of the Man-Thing. He says, I think the success or failure of Man-Thing was due almost entirely to the stories. Some of the characters surrounding him, it was a case of just being able to find something in that book that you couldn't find someplace else. The horror stories had a certain basic appeal. The idea of a muck monster had a certain basic appeal. It was also a very well-designed character. The look of the monster was much better, for example, than that of Swamp Thing. It was an interesting character to look at. I think that's one reason he did so well for a while. At the time Man-Thing was introduced in Fear, and through the first 4 issues or so of his own magazine, the book was one of Marvel's top sellers. Now, I find this next part interesting. It had been a monthly. The book was doing extremely well up through the last Fool Killer stories. At times, percentage-wise, outselling Dracula and Spider-Man. Now, I find that really intriguing. He says it was the top book of the line for a couple of months. Then, mysteriously, with the 5th issue, Mike Ploog's first. You'll remember from our coverage, of course, that Mike Ploog is the artist. He says the sales started dropping and never recovered. It was a slow but steady decline until toward the end, it was selling in the middle 30s in terms of percent. They cannot continue a book that has that sort of sales figures. Now, what I find really interesting about that, folks, today in 2021, if you have a Marvel comic selling in those numbers, it's considered a smash hit. But back then, 1975, 1976, it was, ready for cancellation. When asked about why that happened with the book, Gerber says, I think that part of it was that horror comics in general were losing their appeal. Part of it was overexposure. There was a time when there were 16 Man-Things a year, 4 quarterlies, he's talking about the giant size, and 12 regular books, he's talking about the monthly. And he was appearing on the cover of Monsters Unleashed, and there were also 6 Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson Swamp Thing stories coming out from DC. People got tired of muck monsters after a while. The Swamp Thing character lasted longer, but I don't think he ran as many issues still as when Man-Thing was around. We did 37 or 38 issues of those books. I don't know how long Swamp Thing was. The interviewer points out that an editor at Marvel told them that one of the things that contributed to Man-Thing's eventual failure was Steve Gerber's writing, because it had gone either too far in one direction or been too esoteric or too above the heads of the kid audience. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. If you follow comics news, pop culture news, then you know that Marvel, over the last several years, has had a problem with editors being shitty to creators. Let's just put a fine point on it. But that's nothing new. Okay, that also happened in the aughts. It happened in the 90s. It happened in the 80s. And, we know that it happened in the 70s. But I found it almost a bit of foreshadowing, knowing what eventually happened with Gerber and Marvel, that this editor is telling the interviewer this. I also find it ludicrous. I read that giant-sized Man-Thing issue at age 8. I was reading Adventure into Fear at age 8. They didn't go over my head. Maybe I didn't understand all the subtext, but I was smart enough to get what Gerber was going for. As we've said, everything I learned about race relations living in completely white rural Appalachian Pennsylvania in the 1970s, I learned from Steve Gerber's Man-Thing, the occasional issue of Luke Cage, Hero for Hire, and Sesame Street. That's where I learned it from, folks. So to say it was going over the heads of the kids, I call bullshit on that. And, Chris has said himself, as well, that these Bronze Age Marvel comics didn't go over to his kids, over his head as a kid. We heard about it last week in the letter from Chris Caponegro. And Chris, I apologize again if I've mangled your last name, but, Chris says in there that Gerber never wrote down to him as a kid, and he didn't. So I take a lot of issue with that. What does Gerber say about it? Well, he says, I don't think those stories were terribly complex at all. I think they were just different from what was appearing in other books. I don't think you had to be a Harvard graduate, a member of the literati, to understand those stories. I frankly don't find anything terribly profound in them. The character lent itself to a very different treatment than Dracula or the Hulk or other monsters. In a sense, the whole thing, the empathy process, the orientation of the series, the character demanded a different kind of story, and that's what I gave it. I don't know. Maybe my writing did kill it. I would be willing to accept that as a possibility, but I don't think that's totally the truth. And I would agree with him here. I think he's absolutely right, in that, the Man-Thing demands a different kind of story. I think we see that in the best Man-Thing stories. In Gerber's run, in J.M.D. Mateus's run, in the third incarnation of the book, the best Man-Thing stories are ones that are told unlike other comic book stories. They talk about Gerber leaving the book right before it got canceled. And he says, I didn't feel I had any more to give it. I just felt that after the 22nd issue of its own book, I didn't have any more Man-Thing stories in me. I was surprised that I had stuck with the book that long. I was thinking of getting off it as early as the time Plug left. I was then persuaded to stay with it, and I did. And I really couldn't keep up with it longer than that. I was grateful that it was canceled when it was. So there you have it. Steve Gerber himself talking about his time on the Man-Thing. Again, that is from a book called Steve Gerber, Conversations, published in paperback and on Kindle by University Press of Mississippi. It's edited by Jason Sachs, Eric Huffman, and Dominic Grace. And again, folks, I highly, highly, highly recommend this book. And if you want to hear more from Gerber himself on his time, then I would encourage you, wherever you're listening to Defenders Dialogue, to go back through the archives and track down episode 44, back from 2018, and give that a listen. It's young Scott Edelman and young Steve Gerber sitting down, talking shop, and my God, how lucky are we to have an audio recording of that. And how lucky are we to have listeners like you? We appreciate you. And you know who else we appreciate? We appreciate our engineer, Matt Wilderson, who makes us sound good every week. That's not empty praise either. Matt really is an essential part of the show, even though you never hear him on mic. If you would like to support the show, the best way to do that is to support Matt. Go to Amazon.com, type in Matt Wilderson, WILDASIN, and buy one of his books. It's that easy, folks. Just buy one of his books. They're available in paperback. And, just by buying one book for, what is it, $6, $7, $8, you're supporting this show. And we really, really, really appreciate it. Okay, next week, Chris will be back with me. We'll get back into Gerber's Man-Thing. As we said, after that, for those of you reading along at home, we've got Legion of Monsters coming up. And then we're going to start alternating Marvel Team Up and Marvel 2-in-1 Excelsior. True believers.
Defenders Dialogue. You can listen to this episode and all previous episodes for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, Google Play Music, and wherever else podcasts are available. Defenders Dialogue is written and produced by Brian Keene and Christopher Golden. Our theme music is by Xander Harris. Our engineer is Matt Wilderson. Check out his books on Amazon.com.